we're just using the direct care, which is the block below that. So block 5 is the relevant part here, that your direct care cost per day, 152.46, which is then inflated using an inflation factor, which brings up to $159.10, which is case mix adjusted to all payer, and then compared to the statewide median, which is 112.14, and so that's the specific, which is then Medicaid adjusted. So that's where that component of the rate comes in, and it comes out to 110.49. Page 3, we have the 3 components in block 6 that are paid at median. And here, you've got what your specific cost per day was in column A, the inflation factor in column B, which leads to the inflated cost per day in column C. And the actual rate that you would get would be the statewide median, which is shown in column D. So in this case, what this is showing is your administrative is actually lower than the statewide median. That your inflated administrative cost is $30.86 a day. The statewide median is $37.97. So for that component, you're actually going to get paid an additional $7.11 more per day. However, that's not true of all components. The other support, the laundry, kitchen, housekeeping, things of that nature, you're substantially higher there for that component than the statewide median. And then lastly, plant maintenance, you're actually a little bit higher than the statewide median. Lastly, you've got the capital component, and your capital component is substantial because of the new construction. That is capped at the 85th percentile, which is considerably lower. Right now, because of the fact that it's a brand new facility, and that the costs being what they were to construct it, your cost component is the highest in the state. So here, your facility is most impacted by this 85th percentile cap, because essentially what this is saying is the amount per day you're getting is going to be at the ceiling. Okay, the next page, the final page, shows each of these 5 subcomponents, what they add together to be, which in this case would be $218.29. Then the budget neutrality factor, which is statewide, is 28.32%. And so when that's factored in, that essentially subtracts $61.82, leaving a Medicaid payment rate for your nursing facility of $156.47 a day. So that is essentially how the initial rate setting is calculated. The Medicaid quality incentive payment essentially is used to negate some of that. I'll go into that in a few minutes. Before I do that, I want to talk briefly about atypical nursing facilities. Yes, go ahead.
So Chairman, just as you had mentioned, is that as you had said, the legislative appropriation, as this indicates, would not be sufficient to cover the true costs. So here's where you see that reduction.
Yep.
As Jonathan goes into these 2 additional payments to help offset this reduction, in addition to receiving your Medicaid, you're going to receive what's known as the MQIP payment, and then you'll also be receiving a pro-share payment. So we'll kind of get into those. So those were put into place to try to help offset some of that reduction that's kind of happening in this first step.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Atypical nursing homes, relevant for you to know as far as county nursing homes are concerned, because there are 3 counties that have atypical behavioral units. These are essentially special care paid outside of the rates, that if outside of the acuity-based rates. These are for either a nursing home or a part of a nursing home that has physical characteristics and staffing for services that are highly specialized in nature. So it would be incompatible for the purpose of calculating rates to factor these residents into the acuity. In the case of the behavioral units, and the slide on the bottom of page 8 shows essentially you are in the behavioral unit in Cheshire County, there are 16 beds. Hillsborough County, 22 beds, and Stratford County, 19 beds. These are separate locked units in each of these facilities for specialized behavioral care residents who would not work in the regular population. And in theory, these 3 nursing homes would be receptive to take, if they have available beds, to taking in any residents that, let's say, you had that you couldn't care for due to their behaviors here, that they would be able to go to one of the other counties to these units, as well as any private facilities that wanted to send residents there. The stipend.
How do you apply for a behavioral bed?
Well, these were actually predated the acuity-based unit, and to date, there hasn't been a statewide need for additional beds for these.
So it's set by the state?
The state approves any atypical units, because these are carved out from the regular rate that paid outside of the regular rates, and we try to limit these based on need. So we've been keeping a close eye. Stratford County, which would probably be physically the closest one to you, does turn over these beds fairly often. So if you had the need to send a resident who had these need for these specialized behavioral care, they most likely could accommodate that as needed.
No, they must have a waiting list too.
It varies.
So why would they take ours if they have a...
It varies. It depends on the unique circumstances. Stratford County have had available beds at times. Sometimes there are waiting lists at these facilities. For whatever reason, Cheshire historically has always, they have the fewest too, with only 16 beds, but they've historically had a waiting list for theirs. Hillsborough, it varies. Stratford actually tends to turn over their beds most frequently in this unit. Other atypical, we have ventilator-dependent care, and you may have heard something about this because right now the only facility with ventilator beds is Exeter Healthcare, and they're actually closing that nursing home subunit, scheduled to close by September 30th, 2012, if not sooner. So we're currently working with facilities to actually have new vent units, and we're currently negotiating with a couple places in the state that are willing to take on these highly specialized,
private nursing
highly
homes?
acute. Yeah, both facilities that have indicated strong interest in doing this are private, one of which is affiliated with a national chain that has similar type vent units elsewhere in the country, so they have experience with this type of care. We first presented this need at Exeter notified the state at the end of this last September that they were going to close a year from that date, if not sooner. And at the Nursing Facility Technical Advisory Committee 2 weeks after that, we made the appeal that if anyone was interested in getting into this type of business, please let us know and submit a proposal, and we'll work with you. And we only received the 2 proposals, so those are the 2 that are being evaluated. There's also a high-cost case unit at Edgewood Center, that's in Portsmouth. And these are for highly specialized, labor-intensive residents. Typically, as you can see from the number there, it's maximum of 5 beds. Sometimes it's as few as 2 that they might have at any point in time. And these are patients that literally there was nowhere else in the state that they could go. That if this facility didn't take them on, they'd probably have to go to Boston to a much higher cost specialized nursing home.
So people going into any one of these kinds of specialized care,
yes,
they could be someone you were taking care of but got considerably worse.
You could no longer meet that need. Let's say if you had someone who, for whatever reason, had to go into the hospital, and when they came out they needed to be on a ventilator 24 hours, your nursing home isn't set up to accommodate that, so they would have to go to another facility that would be. If you could no longer meet the medical needs of the resident. moving on to the Medicaid Quality Incentive Program. Brief handout here that I think would assist you with that. This chart essentially shows that it's applicable to all licensed facilities with nursing home beds.
Is this commonly known as the bed tax?
It's euphemistically known as the bed tax, and a few other euphemisms I won't repeat that they also refer to it as. Essentially, it's a 5.5% tax paid as the nursing facility quality assessment. They use the term assessment, not tax. That was the legislators' just initial calling of it. But it's essentially a tax of 5.5% of net revenue. 75% of that is then transferred to Health and Human Services. It used to be 100%. And in the last legislative session, so as of July 1, 2011, the legislature decided to divert 25% of that tax money collected to the general fund, as opposed to going back to Health and Human Services for the quarterly supplemental rates.
Could you refresh me as who pays this tax?
This tax is paid by the nursing homes based on their net patient services revenue. And I'll go into the definition of that in a few minutes as well. So essentially what this money is transferred from the NFQA to Health and Human Services. We're then able to double the amount that we receive with federal matching Medicaid funds. So we're going to take this collected tax, double the amount that we get, which used to be 100 cents on the dollar, and it's now 75 cents on the dollar. Collect federal funds from that, and then we pay that back as supplemental Medicaid rates through the Medicaid Quality Incentive Program. And this is paid to both private and county facilities based on their Medicaid utilization. So going back to the presentation of the slides, go ahead.
Just in terms of a very simple dollar, let's say, a dollar comes in. What that means is a dollar is paid to the Department of Revenue. 75 cents comes back to the Department of Health and Human Services. That amount is doubled to $1.50, and then $1.50, 75 times 2, $1.50, is able to be paid back out to the nursing homes in a Medicaid quality incentive payment.
So you made 50 cents.
You mean after it's matched by the feds?
Yes.
Correct.
Right. Whereas it used to, prior to July 1 of 2011, 100% of that tax got doubled and paid back to the nursing homes.
So the dollar came in, it got matched at the dollar, so you had $2 that would go back out as opposed to $1.75 that goes back out.
Right, right. So this is a way the state is making up for less money coming in, because they're taking money out of this.
The legislature chose to do this in the last budget session.
And this, right, that was a change effective this past July 1st, 2011.
So these are paid out, the MQIP, Medicaid Quality Incentive Program, and basically these are quarterly supplemental rates. This began on November 1, 2004, and even then it was retroactive back to May 1, 2003. And as of January 2012, a total of $282 million in incremental federal funds have been collected through this program to match the quality assessment tax returns collected. So we've essentially, since May 1, 2003 to January 2012, we've collected approximately $282 million in tax revenues that we've been able to then get a federal match on to pay back to the nursing homes.
So
this has been fairly lucrative for this.
What you're saying, though, is the MQIP is going to be less.
Yeah, it has been since July 1 of 2011,
Yeah.
since 25% of it was diverted. This is done through this MQIP and NFQA is two separate and distinct processes required by federal law. And what that means is there's no hold harmless here in that what a nursing home pays in on the tax has no direct relationship to what they receive back. They're paying 5.5% to the revenue, and so the tax and the Medicaid payment are two separate processes handled by two separate agencies.
So if I go back to my dollar example, that's not you paid $1 in and you're going to get X dollars back. So that's where Jonathan's trying to separate out that process is all the facilities are paying this tax that's going into a pool. Then we'll talk about how that pool then is divided back out to all the homes. So it's not a direct dollar for dollar match.
Right.
Okay.
You're back.
Yep. So the quality tax returns.
A lot of red tape, I think. A lot of paperwork.
The quality assessment tax returns, essentially the filings and collections are handled by the Department of Revenue, and you can find this under Title V of the Title V of the Taxation Laws, Chapter 84C, and Revenue Rules 2700. I've got the site here, you can reference it. Okay, the other piece of the process, the part handled by Health and Human Services, which my area is directly responsible for, is the payment back. And this is done through a copy of the tax return is also sent to us as well as revenue, because we actually do the audit on that. And the payments are paid out, and this is in RSA 151E 15, which details that in the citation there. Now, the definition of the net patient service revenue that's paid in to the Department of Revenue is that this means revenues earned on an accrual basis of accounting, net of deducted amounts for bad debt, charity care, and pay or discounts by a nursing facility for service provided to revenues as provided for, and then there's a federal citation. What that means is essentially you're paying a tax on your net revenue. But if you had any free care, charity care, discounts, things of that nature, things that, where you wouldn't be paid, you don't have to pay taxes on those. So you're netting out anything that you gave away. But anything that you still had revenue on, you're paying as long as it's related to the patient care. That's why it says patient services revenue. So let's say, for example, you also had investment funds. Let's say a private nursing home had investment and they made interest off that. Well, they wouldn't have to pay tax on that. That's not related to patient care. That's outside of it. So, but whatever your patient revenue was. And where this is also relevant is, say, for example, the state has some continuing care retirement communities which offer the full continuum of care. They've got elder apartments, typically an assisted living as well as a nursing home. They're actually only paying that tax on the nursing home part of the business. They're not paying it on the other pieces of their business. So this only relates to the nursing home beds. Similarly, you've got some county facilities that have other businesses. For example, Rockingham County Nursing Home also has an assisted living. They also have an adult medical day program. They do not pay the tax on those two programs, only on the nursing home part of the business.
Are we allowing questions at all?
Go ahead, yes.
Net patient service revenues. I mean, by all estimations that I can make here, there are no net revenues. What costs are being deducted from the services provided to the residents? So it becomes net revenue.
Well, essentially, this is, from an accounting standpoint, what the facility looks at as net nursing home revenue. But what they're netting out is your free care, your charity care, things of that nature that are provided that there's no revenue source for. If there's no revenue source coming in, then you don't have to pay a tax on that. But anything that's paid through a revenue source, be it private pay, private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, anything that there's a payment source on, that's the revenue that you're counting and you're doing the tax.
It's actually the gross revenue. Because you're not letting us deduct cost of nursing, cost of
No, you only
beds, cost of
all you're netting out is your free care.
Okay.
Your free care, your charity care, your bad debt.
It's gross less those.
So let's say you had a private pay patient. that you have a receivable of $10,000 that you expect to be paid for. And for whatever reason, the patient dies, their state is such that they don't have $10,000, they can only give you $8,000. Well, you're going to write off that other $2,000. Well, that other $2,000 you would net out of what you have to pay for the tax. You wouldn't count that.
Okay. Interesting use of the word net.
Okay. The timeline on the filings for NFQA and input. Essentially what you're doing is you're making your filing at the end of the quarter to the Department of Revenue on or before the 10th day following the quarter. Health and Human Services will then make the payment in the latter half of that month based on what the filing was, based on the total collections and how much related to the facility. Then the electronic fund payment is made to Revenue on the second to last business day of the month. So essentially, you're filing earlier in the month saying this is how much we anticipate we're going to be paying. You actually receive the payment from Health and Human Services before it has to actually be paid, and then you're making the payment at the end of the month. So you're actually receiving back the input money before you actually have to physically pay the NFQA monies.
Yep.
And this is done for cash flow purposes. As far as how the input rate is calculated, essentially what we're doing is first we start with the rate variance between the acuity-based full payment rate and the budget-neutral Medicaid rate. So in other words, what we're doing, if you go back to the last page on the detailed calculation sheet for your amount of your community, yes, we're showing in Block 7 that the full payment rate, the sum of the components was $218.29, but what we actually paid you was that $156.47. So that budget neutrality variance in between, that 28.32%, which in your case worked out to $61.82. That's our starting point for figuring out where we're going to pay your input. We're using that, we're taking that variance in there, the amount, and what we're doing is we're then taking that amount by the paid Medicaid days. So we're saying, okay, we shorted you $61.82 from what the methodology says you should have been paid. We're going to multiply that by how many paid Medicaid days you had during that quarter, and saying this is the amount of money that we should have been able to make, that we want to make up with you. We're then going to take the pot of money that we've collected from the NFQA, then doubled with the federal funds, and we have so this larger pot of money from everybody.
Is there a cap on that?
It's based on what was collected.
Okay.
So, which was the 5.5% for everybody. So we're taking that amount of money, and we're comparing essentially how much has been collected and matched to how much it would take to pay everybody's budget neutrality variance. And then we adjust that up or downward until the full amount is expended. Now initially, for the first several years of this program, the amount collected and matched exceeded the amount of that budget neutrality hole. So we were essentially actually able to pay back everything in that variance, and it still had left over that we paid that as a positive budget neutrality factor on top of that. That was when the tax was also 6%. When the tax got changed federally from 6 to 5.5%, that was the very first time that the amount collected and then doubled did not exceed that budget neutrality hole. So from that point on, we started paying less, and then from July on, when they suddenly diverted 25% of the amount collected, then that's had a substantial difference in the amount that you get back from this. So initially, though, this MQIP was designed to fully compensate. In fact, when it went into effect retroactive to 2003 and 2004, the amount of the budget neutrality hole was $24 million, and the amount collected, the amount of the incremental amount, not even just the amount collected, but the incremental amount we got back from the feds was that $24 million. So, I mean, it was an exact way of filling that budget neutrality hole. As I said, because of the reduction from 6 to 5.5% of the tax, and because of the 25% now diverted, that's no longer the case.
So back to your, if you use your current example, a few years ago, that $61 that was deducted, you more than made that up. You had 61 plus some extra. And so now it's been a little bit less. And I don't know if you have, I didn't think to bring this today, the exact.
That's on the next page.
Okay.
Okay, returning actually to page 12. Okay, there's one slide talking about the reporting. Essentially, you report the assessment fees collected in the cost report. This is included in the administrative component, and when we do our desk reviews and field audits, we check the returns to make sure they're correct. Okay, what Sherry's referring to is the bottom block here on page 12. This shows, as of January 1, 2012, what the average Medicaid nursing facility, this is a statewide average of all facilities. So what you see there is the full acuity rate would have been, for everyone on average, would have been 203.91. And what that shows is actually, if you look to page 4 on the detail for your facility, you're $15, almost $15 above the statewide average there.
You were at 218.
218.29.
Versus the 203.
Right. So the statewide average there's 203. Budget neutrality factor 28.2%. At statewide average, we're taking 57.75 away. So the initial Medicaid rate statewide is 146.16. Now for your facility, it's actually higher than that. You're at 156.47. So your rate is $10.31 higher than the statewide average. You then have your MQIP. Now, this MQIP, again, we're essentially 1 quarter behind because this was the MQIP rate paid in January of 2012. And that would actually be the quarter related to the quarter that ended December 31, 2011. But the MQIP rate paid in January is $33.16. And so this leads to a total average Medicaid rate of $179.32. I did not bring with me what your specific MQIP rate was, so I should have looked that up. But anyway, but the average from January was $33.60.
Which is a little more than 50% of that budget neutrality that's getting made whole. So in your case, around the 61. You probably were maybe about 50% of that came back in MQIP. And we can give you that exact, but as we said years ago, full 61 came back to you.
Yeah.
And between the reduced tax that's coming in.
Right. So essentially, the January MQIP was statewide was $33.16. Bear in mind, 25% of the money collected was diverted. So if that hadn't happened, this would have been $44.24.
And just to review,
Yes.
revisit the tax.
Yes.
Of the $179, $9.90 is taxed again next year.
You're saying of that $179.32, 5.5% of it would be taxed? Yes, that would be the case.
So you're being taxed on the money that you're
because this becomes as you receive what you receive in your rates is revenue, and you're taxed on the revenue. And quite frankly, in 2004, we expected the feds to actually say no, that the amount you got through MQIP wouldn't be taxable, but they said it was, because we didn't think they would approve a tax on a tax, but they did. So we're following the federal guidelines.
From an operational standpoint, you're really only realizing about $24 on your MQIP reimbursement, because you got to figure that $9.90 what's going back in tax next year, right?
You'll always have an amount paid in as well as coming back. That's correct. The counties do benefit more than the privates from this overall process because of the fact that the counties have a higher Medicaid percentage than the privates. What you pay in is based on 5.5% of your revenue regardless of what your paying source is. What you get back is only for your paid Medicaid days. And so since the counties have a higher percentage of Medicaid, they get a higher percentage overall of this input. So they have a higher benefit of